The torchlight flickered low as shadows danced across the high-covered walls of the great tent. Outside, the Huns feasted late into the night, their roaring laughter echoing beneath the black skies of the Hungarian plain. Inside, Attila, the king of the Huns, sat at the head of the celebration, flushed with triumph. Just months before, Attila had led a shocking invasion of Italy, burning and pillaging, spreading fear through the once mighty Roman Empire. He had retreated across the Danube River to his homeland to pass the winter, but that was no matter. When spring came, he returned his attention to the east, to the immeasurable riches of Constantinople. But on this winter night, Attila wasn't celebrating his victories. He was celebrating his wedding. Not his first, though it would be his last. His new bride was a young Gothic woman named Ildiko. Attila drank deeply in her honor. Wine flowed like Roman blood, and the king of the Huns had more than his share. As the party wound down, Attila took his new bride to bed. The fires dimmed, the stars above held their breath. The following morning, Attila didn't stir. The following account of what happened next comes to us from the chronicler Jordanes. On the following day, when a great part of the morning was spent, the royal attendants suspected something ill, and after a great uproar, broke in the doors. There, they found the death of Attila accomplished by an effusion of blood, without any wound, and the girl with a downcast face weeping beneath her veil. Then, as is the custom of that race, they plucked out the hair of their heads and made their faces hideous with deep wounds that the renowned warrior might be mourned, not by effeminate wailing and tears, but by the blood of men. Ever since, people have wondered what exactly caused Attila's death. Did the king of the Huns die of natural causes, or was he poisoned? If the Romans orchestrated Attila's death, they were well rewarded for doing so. The Huns emerged out of nowhere to terrorize the world, and after Attila's death, they became a shadow of their former selves and finally vanished from history. Even if Attila wasn't poisoned, why did he stop his invasion of Rome when he seemed on the cusp of victory? The answers to these questions tell us much about the life of one of history's most feared men. This is the story of Attila, the Scourge of God. Welcome to History Snob. So, who was Attila the Hun? Like the Huns themselves, his origins are somewhat mysterious. Here's what we do know. Attila was born around 406 AD into the ruling family of the Huns who had migrated westward from Central Asia into the steppes north of the Danube River. The Huns were feared across Europe for their savage raids, swift horsemen, and military prowess. The Huns were a nomadic people of Central Asian origin who emerged in the historical record during the 4th century AD. They are most famously known for their terrifying invasions of Europe under the leadership of Attila, but their roots stretch far deeper into the steppes of modern-day Mongolia, Kazakhstan, and possibly even further east. Their exact origins remain debated. Some scholars connect them to Xiongnu, a confederation of nomadic tribes that harassed China's northern borders during the Han Dynasty. What's certain is that by the time they appeared in Eastern Europe around 370 AD, they had already perfected a fearsome style of warfare that emphasized mobility, shock tactics, and psychological terror. Riding small but powerful horses, the Huns were expert archers and could shoot with deadly accuracy even while galloping at full speed. Their arrival on the European frontier helped trigger the so-called domino effect that contributed to the fall of the Western Roman Empire as panicked tribes like the Goths and the Vandals fled westward into Roman territory to escape the coming of the Huns. One of the most interesting and, to outsiders, frightening features of the Huns was their appearance. From a young age, Hun children underwent cranial deformation, a custom where their heads were bound with cloth or boards to elongate the skull, creating a distinct and intimidating look. This practice, which was both aesthetic and possibly a marker of social status, made them stand out even more from other people they encountered. They were also known for self-inflicted facial scars, often earned in rites of passage, which were meant to make them resemble fierce warriors and to show stoic endurance of pain. But despite their fearsome reputations, the Huns were not mindless barbarians. They had a highly organized society, especially under Attila, with clear military and political structures. They engaged in diplomacy, strategic marriage alliances and treaties, and often extracted tribute through intimidation rather than war. Perhaps the best way to think of the Huns is as a sort of mafia. They would take gold from the Romans in exchange for not attacking. Sometimes they would attack just to show that they were still dangerous or to extract more payment. But in general, their objective was to run a protection racket on the Roman Empire, not to destroy it. The Hunnic Empire was a multi-ethnic coalition composed of not just Huns but also subjugated tribes like the Goths, Alans, Slavs, and Sarmatians. Attila acted as a kind of overlord, and tribal leaders were expected to send troops and resources in exchange for protection or face brutal retaliation. Interestingly, the Huns left no written record of their own, which has fueled both fascination and myth-making. Almost everything we know about them comes from Roman and Greek sources, many of which viewed them with a mixture of horror, awe, and exoticism. This has made it difficult to separate fact from legend. For example, Roman historians often describe them as almost subhuman, living without fire, eating raw meat, and dwelling in wagons, yet archaeological evidence suggests that they had sophisticated metalwork, traded with distant cultures, and even used silk, likely acquired through the Silk Road. This is the world Attila was born into, a world he would gradually come to remake in his own image. Attila's father was Munzuk, a member of the royal line, and his uncles were kings Rugila and Octa, who ruled together. It seems the Huns had a tradition of sharing power, at least until Attila became king, but more on that later. In his youth, Attila's uncles shaped the Huns into a dominant force in Eastern Europe that would later come to threaten the entire Roman world. As a young noble, Attila received a traditional education in riding, archery, hand-to-hand combat, and strategy, but he was also trained in diplomacy and foreign languages. The Huns interacted regularly with the Roman Empire, sometimes as allies, sometimes as enemies, and Attila would have been taught how to read the political landscape, especially when dealing with Rome or the Byzantine, that is, the Eastern Roman Empire. In fact, during his youth, Attila and his brother Bleda were sent as hostages to the Roman court, a common practice in that time meant to guarantee peace treaties. There, he would have been exposed to Roman customs, military tactics, and court politics, all of which he would later exploit with brutal precision. When King Rugila died around 434 AD, Attila and his older brother Bleda inherited joint rule over the Huns. Almost immediately, the brothers negotiated a treaty with the Eastern Roman Empire at Margus, in modern-day Serbia, which required the Romans to pay an annual tribute of 700 pounds of gold, double what had previously been agreed. The two ruled together for nearly a decade, negotiating treaties with Rome and demanding tribute in gold in exchange for peace. They were shrewd leaders, using threats of invasion to extract wealth while avoiding full-scale war. In these early years, Attila demonstrated two traits that would define his leadership: ruthless diplomacy and relentless intimidation. He and Bleda launched devastating raids into Roman territory whenever tribute was delayed or perceived insults were made. The Treaty of Margus was often violated by both sides, and Attila used any breach as a pretext for war or plunder. Like we said, Attila was essentially a mob boss who happened to rule an empire, and Attila was about to get even more brutal. Around 445 AD, Bleda mysteriously died. The virtual consensus is that Attila got tired of sharing power and killed him. The traditional account is that Bleda was killed during a hunt. With Bleda gone, Attila became the sole ruler of the Hunnic Empire, and it became clear he had more ambition than previous rulers. He began unifying various Hun and allied tribes under his rule, turning his confederation into a formidable war machine. His empire stretched across Central and Eastern Europe, from the Ural River to the Danube. In AD 447, Attila made his first big move as sole ruler of the Huns. After the Eastern Roman Empire failed to pay the agreed protection money, Attila went to war. His forces swept through the Balkans, destroying over 70 cities, including Naissus, modern-day Niš, and pushing as far south as Thermopylae in Greece. The devastation forced Emperor Theodosius II to sue for peace. The Romans agreed to triple their tribute payments and also ceded territory along the Danube River to Attila. For a time, Attila ruled Eastern Europe unopposed, with Roman gold flowing steadily into his treasury. But in AD 451, one of the strangest events in history completely altered Attila's plans. In that year, Attila received a letter from Honoria, the sister of the Western Roman Emperor Valentinian III. Honoria was something of a party princess, and her family was forcing her to settle down and marry a boring old senator she hated. Out of desperation, some would say insanity, Honoria decided to reach out to Attila, begging for rescue. Honoria included a signet ring with her letter in order to demonstrate that the plea was genuine. Attila must have laughed himself hoarse when he read Honoria's letter. He had spent his days terrorizing and extorting the Eastern Roman Empire. Now he had a perfect pretext to attack the West. Attila claimed that Honoria's letter constituted an offer of marriage since it included a ring. He graciously accepted this offer and humbly requested half the Western Roman Empire as dowry. When Rome refused, Attila invaded Gaul, modern-day France, with an enormous army, claiming that he merely sought what was his by right. His path of destruction brought panic across the region. However, near the city of Chalons, he was met by a coalition of Roman and Visigothic forces led by the Roman general Flavius Aetius. The resulting battle, the Battle of Catalaunian Plains, was brutal and indecisive. Attila was defeated, marking his first major setback. But his army was far from destroyed. Bloodied, but not broke, the Huns withdrew to the east to lick their wounds. Attila was just getting warmed up. In AD 452, Attila the Hun gave up on France and instead wheeled south to invade Italy. If he couldn't have Gaul, he would plunder his way to the heart of Rome itself. Crossing the Alps with a massive army, Attila descended into the Po Valley and began laying waste to cities and towns with brutal speed. The city of Aquileia, a key Roman stronghold, resisted but was ultimately razed to the ground and never fully rebuilt. Panic swept through the empire as Attila's forces continued their rampage, destroying cities like Padua, Verona, and Milan. Refugees fled south, and Rome itself stood exposed. You may be asking, where was the Roman army? The answer is that it barely existed at this point. Flavius Aetius had been able to defeat Attila the previous summer with the help of barbarians who were occupying France. They had agreed to team up with the Romans because they feared the Huns more, but they weren't going to march south to save the emperor. Deprived of his allies, Aetius's Roman army was too small to confront the Huns head-on. All he could do was shadow them and try to harass their supply lines. Possessing no power to fight Attila, the Western Emperor Valentinian III instead sent a delegation to sue for peace, led by Pope Leo I. This would become one of the most famous meetings in all of history. Leo was received by Attila near the river Mincho. What passed between them remains a mystery, but shortly after the meeting, Attila unexpectedly turned around and left Italy forever. To many Christians, Leo's intervention was a miracle, but Attila had several practical reasons for retreating. His army had been weakened by famine and disease. It was hard enough to find enough forage for all the Huns' horses. Supplies were running low, and word had reached the Huns that their own lands had been invaded in their absence. Also, it's very likely that Leo brought a good amount of gold with him. Whatever the reason, Attila's retreat was a huge reprieve. His invasion, though short-lived, left northern Italy in ruins and represented a turning point in the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, which would cease to exist 23 years later. After meeting with Leo, Attila himself was finished. He returned home, where he died the following winter, as we describe in the opening. And here's where we come to the question of how Attila died. The Roman Emperor Marcian had stopped paying the Huns their tribute. No doubt, when spring came, Attila would have come for his money. Conveniently for Marcian, the king of the Huns died at his own wedding. Marcian certainly had a motive to assassinate Attila, but the truth is the Scourge of God probably died of a hemorrhage, a result of living rough and drinking to excess. The Huns themselves apparently didn't believe Attila was murdered. One account of his eulogy includes this: "He fell, not by wound of the foe, nor by treachery of friends, but in the midst of his nation at peace, happy in his joy and without sense of pain. Who can rate this as death when none believes it calls for vengeance?" Attila's empire would barely outlive him. His sons tried to maintain control over the Hunnic Empire, but internal divisions brought them down. In 454 AD, a coalition of former vassals led by the king Ardaric of the Gepids defeated the Huns at Nideo, likely in modern-day Hungary. The Huns were crushed and Attila's sons were either killed or driven into obscurity. There's one more chilling detail that's worth mentioning: how Attila was buried and what happened to those who buried him, according to Jordanese. They bound his coffins, the first with gold, the second with silver, and the third with the strength of iron. Iron, because he subdued the nations. Gold and silver, because he received the honors in both empires. They also added the arms of foemen won in the fight, trappings of rare worth, sparkling with various gems and ornaments of all sorts. And that so great riches might be kept from human curiosity, they slew those appointed to the work, a dreadful pay for their labor, and thus sudden death was the lot of those who buried him, as well as of him who was buried. Attila the Hun left behind a legacy of fear, power, and myth. He terrorized the Roman world in the 5th century, leading brutal campaigns that helped accelerate the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Though his empire crumbled soon after his death, Attila's name became a symbol of ruthless strength and apocalyptic destruction. In Christian Europe, he was seen as divine punishment. In Germanic and Hungarian legend, he became a complex, even heroic figure. Over time, he transformed from a feared warlord into a legendary king whose story still stirs fascination centuries after his death. That's all for this video. What do you think of Attila the Hun? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe to History Snob for more cool historical content. Thanks for watching.